a collection of individuals greater than the sum of its parts.
People of all different kinds, with different sets of skills that come together and align. Because freedom is what matters.
It is why we must stand tall, and it's why we always tell them,
All for one, and one for all.
Alors, bonjour, Monsieur le Secrétaire général délégué. Merci beaucoup d'avoir accepté de nous parler aujourd'hui en préparation de notre sommet sur la digitalisation de la défense et de la sécurité. Thank you very much for taking the time to answer some questions, and I guess we'll go right into it, Mr. Geoană. Our summit today and tomorrow is going to bring together Western political, military, and industry leaders to discuss the convergence of digital and cyber technologies and their effect on the defense and security of NATO, of countries, and of private business. As we've seen, disruptive technologies are transforming the geopolitics of liberal Western democracies and affecting economies and business. Strategic competitors such as Russia and China are devoting more time and effort to operations in this new and current domain. So from your point of view, how does NATO see these emerging threats within the cyber domain?
Tout d'abord, merci pour l'invitation. Toujours heureux d'être avec nos alliés, amis canadiens. You're right, General. The threat from new technologies, including cyber, is real and significant. And the pandemic, we also have seen unprecedented number of people that have been doing more or less everything online. So malicious cyber activities target our people, as you mentioned, our businesses, and ultimately our societies, especially open democratic societies like ours. And they undermine the trust in democratic processes and institutions. So we have seen also during the pandemic ransomware attacks on hospitals and other healthcare services, including in the Czech Republic or France or Germany. We all remember vividly, and we still process the implications of the attack on SolarWinds, led to backdoor inserted into a huge number of companies and government agencies around the world. Also in Canada, just last week, a significant data breach was reported with one official calling it I quote, the largest cyber attack in Newfoundland and Labrador's history, and among the largest in Canada. So cyber threats and new technologies are introducing a world where NATO, as the number one alliance in human history, we are basically, in a way, called to adapt, to adjust, and act. Because the complex, destructive, coercive implications of technologies and cyber are becoming more frequent. In a way, it's a sort of a new normal in its abnormal way. As our societies and our militaries depend on this digital framework, it is vital that we all do anything we can to secure our networks and digital infrastructure. Because you have rightly described in your presentation, General, that the convergence between digitalization and cybersecurity technologies is something which is very much to my heart. I chair in NATO, on behalf of Secretary General Stoltenberg, the Innovation Board in NATO. I'm also running the cyber adaptation effort here in NATO. And just recently, we have adopted a new AI strategy. Our defense ministers adopted just 2 weeks ago the first AI strategy when it comes to NATO. So EDTs is something that something is very much with us. Let me bring back a little bit of history on how NATO has started to look at cyber very, very attentively. So we have declared in NATO cyber as an operational domain, and you, with your track record in the leadership of NATO on our military side, you know this very well, the significance for NATO to declare cyber as an operational domain back in 2016 at the NATO summit in Warsaw. And ever since, we have continued to adapt. We are now preparing a cyber defense strategy Some nations, like Canada, are also offering to NATO some of their national assets on cyber. And we are working on a continuum on the way to the next NATO summit in Madrid in June of next year into a comprehensive transformation and a roadmap for NATO to be up to the task of doing a few things to resist and quickly recover from any cyber attack. You all know, and probably the ones viewing our interview also do know, that our leaders have also decided that a severe cyber attack could be interpreted under the Article 5 rubric, which means that we have to make sure that this continuum of threats is very well managed by us here in NATO. So how to deter, how to defend against, and how to counter all these threats is something very much we do here at NATO. So resilience of our cyber defenses, resilience of our critical infrastructure, resilience of our supply chains, reducing vulnerabilities is something that we do. And let me say something about digitalization and the future. It is clear that new technologies are changing the very essence of warfare in a way and in a speed like never before in history. So as also our militaries will rely on this digital backbone in order to do what we are supposed to be doing, to protect against any threat from any direction, from any actor. The 1 billion people living in the 30 allied free democratic nations in NATO. This means that we'll have to work not only across a 360 geographical distribution of threats, and we see many of those coming from multiple directions, but also across domains. So to work across domains, air, land, sea, cyberspace, and space, which was also recognized in 2019 as the 5th operational domain, we'll have to have in NATO, and our militaries will need, a digital backbone. This means that we have to redouble our efforts to protect against cyber attacks and malign attempts to disrupt the way in which we run the business of defending our peoples. So I'm very happy that you asked this question, because the intersection between cyber and digitalization is probably, if you want, the essence of this transformative process that NATO is embarking upon, and where countries like Canada and all the other allies are doing lots of things. You also develop as Canada, and we're watching this with great interest, and we support this and encourage our great ally in Canada to develop its cyber capacities. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, launched in 2018, is already world recognized. We also appreciate a lot that Prime Minister Trudeau highlighted the fact that Canada would provide cyber effects to NATO. So this is something that we have to do as an alliance. And I close in saying that we know, this is not new, but this is with us even more intensely than ever before, that we are as strong as our weakest link. So that's why we have to make sure that all allies, big and small, more, let's say, stronger economically, and sometimes a little bit less, that we enhance our resilience to cyber threats across the board, across the 30 ally nations.
Thank you. And obviously the heads of state and nations see this as important, because I guess it was discussed at the summit in June and was part of the declaration from the summit. And so how can NATO encourage nations to do this, to react to these threats?
Listen, we've been doing what we call the cyber pledge exercise in NATO since 2016, when I mentioned that cyber was declared, and we are working with cyber as an operational domain in NATO. This means that on an annual basis, allies are, on a voluntary basis, they are measuring themselves against a set of requirements on cyber defense and cyber resilience, a process which is very, very rewarding for all allies, the larger one, the ones in North America, the ones here in Europe. And this is a way for us to have a growing common threshold for cyber resilience, cyber defense, and cyber adaptation. We also do something which is quite interesting. We organize on an annual basis the largest cyber exercise in the world. Why we do this? First of all, because we are 30 nations, so that's already a lot of nations that are working together, but also because we work with NATO's partners. You mentioned the international rule-based order. We are the most important and successful alliance and powerful alliance in human history, but we know that we have to enhance with like-minded nations, with other democratic nations, with countries that can bring their expertise in a two-way street with NATO ever closer together. I remember vividly one of our many exchanges and intelligence sharing with, I'll give you an example, our NATO Asia-Pacific partners, what we call the AP4, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, on cyber threats. So this is also helping us not only across the Atlantic, in Europe and North America, but actually around the world, to build a shared strategic awareness and also together to enhance our deterrence. So that's massive work, and we are committed in continuing on the way to our next NATO summit. You mentioned the last summit we had in June here in Brussels, but we have a very ambitious agenda that our Madrid summit in 2022, our leaders will adopt even more comprehensive, ambitious, and forward-looking cyber defense strategy.
Excellent. And so one of the things that we're going to discuss tomorrow at our summit is we'll gather a panel of industry leaders to seek their views on digitalization and the threat to private business. What is the NATO approach to relations with private industry in defending digitalization infrastructure and critical assets?
NATO is an alliance of democracies. So engaging with our own societies, with public sector, with private sector, with academia and civil society is of the essence. Also have to take into account that in the last few decades, most of the innovation, most of the technologies are today produced not only in governments or in public institutions, but when it comes to new technologies, I think that more than 80% are invented and put on the market by the private sector. So if we want to harness the number one competitive advantage of our alliance when it compares to nations that are proposing more authoritarian or totalitarian approaches on how to organize human societies, we are in a way called, obliged, and eager to engage with our private sectors. From a practical standpoint, because they produce most of the technology that we are also using in defense and security, but also because we need to educate each other on the needs that we have, and also to be of help in trying to encourage the private sector to also look into account on issues that are the responsible use of new technologies when it comes to AI or big data or quantum computing or biotechnology. This is why we also work with private sector in all 30 nations. I mentioned that I'm chairing the innovation board in NATO. We do this on a very constant basis. You served in Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk as Chief of Staff a few years ago, General. So you know that we also have a strategic command on new technologies. They are also engaging with private sector. Our specialized agencies are also working with the private sector. And this week we'll be organizing in Rome the NATO Industry Forum, when many of the defense and technology firms will be present and will be engaging with us at the top level of the alliance. Let me say just one word, because in having this innovation ecosystem between public, private, and academia in NATO countries, I mentioned, I believe, and this is a fact, is our number one competitive asset in comparison with our competitors. But we also have to harness the issues that are put by other partners, other than nations, like the European Union. European Union has developed a toolbox of instruments that are very useful. A number of allies are also member states of the EU. I'm also working, and NATO is working also the UN. I was just in Geneva, the agencies that are there that are working on standard setting. And we have to make sure that the norms, the standards, and hopefully universal legislation around new technologies and international norms could and should be developed, having at their heart also if you want, the commercial interest of the private sector, but also the values and the ethical thrust that we have to embed in everything we do. And I'm very proud, as I mentioned, that NATO is one of the first big important international organizations that have developed this AI strategy. And if you pay a little bit of attention and you read the AI strategy from NATO, you'll be seeing probably for the first time the recognition of responsible use and also the recognition of the ethical norms when it comes to the security applications of AI and big data. So we need the private sector. We engage with the private sector, and I think we will be in the position to do even more in making sure that we are aligned in sync. And also our new, if you want, transatlantic initiatives on new technologies, Diana, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for North Atlantic, that will have one regional headquarters in North America, another one here in Europe, are also trying to do just that, to create for the private sector, also for the SMEs, for the promising startups, a place where they can use our testing centers of NATO allies, some of our sandboxes, and also to allow them, in a way, minimizing the cost of failure and optimizing the successful technologies. And on top of that, we are also launching a NATO Innovation Fund that will be also helping these companies that have bright ideas for dual use and make sure that we nurture the talent of the private sector, which is the number one asset of what we have as open societies and democratic societies in NATO and in the democratic world.
Dr. Geoană, you're actually answering questions before I pose them. I like that very much. Let me just kind of finish with one of my particular, what I think is one of NATO's greatest accomplishments, and that is interoperability. And you mentioned standards. NATO's always been a champion of interoperability, in my view, and all nations, even those that do not belong currently to NATO, tend to use NATO standards for their operations and tactics. And what's so then to close off, how do you see the importance of interoperability in the digital domain?
You're so much right, General. We are such a successful alliance because of our values, because of our shared interests, but also because we can work, exercise, plan, and act together. So interoperability is, if you want, the essential part of what we do. So it's very clear that as we are moving into the adoption of new technologies in the way in which we conduct the business of keeping our 1 billion people safe against any threat from any direction, from any domain, we'll have to make sure that we keep interoperability very much on the agenda, because we have to recognize not all allies have the same depth of their innovation ecosystem, the same depth of their financial and venture capital markets, or the same depth or endowments of their universities. That's a fact. And that's the beauty of NATO. Because through our defense planning processes, through our exercising together through Diana, as I mentioned, and to many other things that we do, we are making sure that all allies are today and tomorrow able to operate, function, deploy, and God forbid, fight together. So this is why the adoption of new technologies across the board is something which is so important. This is why our military leaders are working on a specific new technologies strategy that is already on the way towards implementation. So when we speak about NATO, You know, when it comes to security, NATO is the gold standard when it comes to defense and security. And we are very much keen in keeping interoperability and making sure that not only NATO, but also many of our partners, as you mentioned, General, they're adopting, even short of a partnership with NATO, our way to do command and control, to prepare for exercises, to train their military and security forces, because NATO is the gold standard. It is the utmost ambition and obligation of us here in NATO to make sure that interoperability remains the core ingredient for making sure that all 30 allies and our militaries will be able also in the future to act together as one, as Article 5 says, one for all and all for one.
Well, Deputy Secretary General, thank you so much for your time. And I'll just close off by reminding our panel and our folks that you recently participated in the 10th GoTech World Conference. And your words at that time spoke about the importance of bytes in big data, which has become as great as bullets and battleships. And so I thank you very much. Je vous remercie beaucoup d'avoir pris le temps de nous parler aujourd'hui et au plaisir de vous rencontrer un moment. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous et bonne chance à votre très importante conférence. Thank you so much and look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you very much, sir. Have a great day.
Thank you.